The night Jonah Langley returned to his family estate, the house seemed to inhale at the sight of him, its walls expanding and contracting as though relieved he had finally come home. The rain carved silver rivers down the windows, blurring the world outside and leaving the crumbling mansion isolated in a pocket of darkness. Something cold and old lived in these rooms, something that remembered him far better than he remembered it. The Langley curse had always been spoken of in fragments, in hushed warnings and unfinished sentences, but Jonah never imagined it was more than folklore meant to scare children away from the old estate. Yet everything changed the night he climbed into the dusty attic and discovered a leather-bound journal hidden beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets. Its pages were brittle, yellowed with age, and the handwriting was jagged, as though written by someone whose hands trembled with fear. As he flipped through its entries, Jonah realized it wasn't a storybook or a diary of personal thoughts, but a detailed record stretching back hundreds of years, all written by Langley men who came before him. The first entry described a birth, twins delivered under a blood-red moon in a creaking farmhouse surrounded by woods that seemed to whisper. What struck Jonah wasn't the birth itself, but what followed. The stronger twin smothered the weaker one moments after taking his first breath. It sounded impossible, a grotesque exaggeration, until he saw that every generation repeated the same event. Every entry spoke of twins. Every one of them ended with only one child surviving. The journal treated the killings not as crimes, but as rites of passage, as though the deaths were required to protect the family from something unnamed, yet terrifyingly real. Jonah kept reading, sweat gathering at the back of his neck as the pages described strange physical marks the surviving twins carried, signs that they had been chosen or altered by the act of killing their sibling. Some entries mention voices in the cradle, small hands grasping at nothing, and cold spots that hovered in nurseries for weeks after a death. It became clear to Jonah that the family didn't consider it a curse. They saw it as heritage, destiny, something expected of every Langley son from the moment he entered the world. The more he read, the more he felt the weight of the past pressing on him, squeezing tightly around his ribs. He wondered why his parents never mentioned any of this, why no one ever whispered these stories in his presence. It wasn't until he reached the last written page that his chest tightened with a mixture of dread and disbelief. The final entry ended abruptly, splattered with ink as if the writer had been interrupted mid-sentence, but it was enough to confirm the worst possibility. Jonah had been born a twin too, something no one had ever told him. The death, the disappearance, the silence, none of it had been an accident. Every generation had followed the same pattern, and now he knew that his own birth had been part of that dark and ancient tradition, hidden from him until the truth clawed its way out of the past. Jonah couldn't sleep after reading the journal, the words circling his mind like shadows refusing to settle. By morning, the house felt heavier, as if it expected him to keep digging. Compelled by something he didn't fully understand, he found himself wandering into the study where his father used to work. Dust coated everything, muting the room into a gray silence. Behind stacks of old deeds and letters, he uncovered a worn wooden box sealed with a rusted lock that snapped the moment he touched it. Inside lay a stack of birth documents, each wrapped carefully in linen that had yellowed with age. Most belonged to ancestors whose names he recognized from the portrait in the hall, but one record lay separate from the rest, folded with unusual care. Jonah unfolded it, expecting to see the familiar scrawl of his own name and date of birth. And he did, except something was unsettlingly wrong. Beneath his name, faint but still readable, was a second line. A second name. A twin. But someone had dragged a blade or ink nib across it so violently that the paper tore, leaving only shredded remnants of letters and a deep scar across the parchment. Jonah stared at the mutilated record, unable to breathe properly. The name hadn't been erased gently or accidentally. It had been destroyed with intention, with desperation, as though the very existence of that second child needed to be obliterated from memory. The longer he looked at the tear marks, the more he felt that whoever scratched out the name wasn't trying to hide it from the public. They were trying to hide it from him. His hands trembled as he traced the edges of the ruined line. The ink around the tear had spread outward, suggesting the act had been done hurriedly, maybe even in panic. What terrified him even more was the faint impression of the missing name still visible beneath the gouges. like a ghost refusing to disappear. He tried to piece together the letters, but the damage was too severe. Yet just the presence of that second name made the air colder, as if acknowledging the twin had summoned something that had been waiting in silence. Jonah felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched, not from behind, but from within the room itself, as though the torn record had awakened a memory the house had been holding back for decades. The deeper realization hit him slowly and then all at once. Someone had erased his twin from paper, from family history, from existence, but not completely. Not enough. Not in the way that mattered. And as Jonah stood there clutching the ruined record, he felt it in his bones that the person whose name had been destroyed was not gone, not forgotten, and not finished with him. The first whisper came late at night, so soft that Jonah thought it was the wind slipping through cracks in the decrepit walls. He was lying awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the image of the torn birth record from his mind. The house had always been quiet, but tonight its silence felt watchful, taut with expectation. He tried to convince himself he was imagining things when he heard it again, a faint, rhythmic scratching, like fingernails dragging slowly over wood. It came from the far corner of his room, behind the old wardrobe that hadn't been moved in decades. Jonah held his breath, listening. The scratching stopped. Then, a whisper so faint it could have been mistaken for a sigh drifted through the room, and though he couldn't understand the words, he recognized the voice instinctively. It was his own. He sat up abruptly, his pulse hammering in his throat. The house remained still, but the air around him had shifted, carrying a subtle vibration, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He tried to rationalize it. Old pipes, settling wood. But the sound had been too deliberate, too close, too aware. The next night, the whispers returned, but this time they didn't stay in the corner. They moved. Jonah could hear soft shifts behind the plaster, as though someone small and agile was crawling between the walls, following the outline of his footsteps as he navigated the rooms. Sometimes the whispers came from behind him, sometimes from above, sometimes from a place so near he felt the hairs on his arms rise. They always repeated one thing, his name. But the way it was spoken was not how he or anyone else said it. It carried an echo, a vibration, a longing that felt ancient and strangely intimate. On the third night, the scratching became more urgent. Jonah pressed his ear to the wall, and his breath caught. He didn't just hear scratching. He heard breathing. Shallow, rapid, uneven breaths, as though whoever was on the other side had been waiting a long time and was finally too excited to remain still. A cold realization spread through Jonah's chest. The journal hadn't been exaggerating. Whatever the Langley men had written about, the voices in the cradle, the cold spots lingering in the nursery, those were not poetic descriptions of guilt or imagination. They were warnings. He stepped back from the wall, but the breathing followed him, shifting to whatever surface he approached, as though the presence inside was tracking him. And even though Jonah tried to remain calm, deep down he understood something terrifying and undeniable. The whispers weren't haunting the house. They were calling for him. Jonah had always avoided the old mirrors in the Langley house. Something about the way they captured light felt wrong, as if they held more than simple reflections. But on the fourth night, after hours of haunted whispers following him from room to room, he found himself standing before the tall, antique mirror in the upstairs hall. Its surface was mottled with age, the glass slightly warped, giving every reflection a faintly distorted edge. He only meant to pass by, but a flicker in the corner of his eye made him stop. At first, he thought the mirror's wavering surface was playing tricks on him. He lifted his hand to run it through his hair, and for a moment everything seemed normal. His reflection copied the movement exactly, though its eyes looked a little darker, its expression a touch more hollow. Jonah chalked it up to exhaustion until it happened again. His reflection hesitated. It was the smallest delay, barely half a second, but unmistakable. Jonah blinked hard and tried again, lifting both hands this time. His real hands moved in perfect time, but the figure in the glass raised theirs fractionally slower, as though trying to match him but learning the rhythm late. Then came the smile. Jonah hadn't smiled. He knew that with cold certainty. Yet the reflection tilted its head, lips curling slowly into a grin that was eerily familiar and entirely wrong. It wasn't joyful or friendly. It was testing something, stretching a muscle unused for years. Drained of warmth, The expression sent a chill down Jonah's spine. He took a step backward, but the reflection remained where it was for a moment too long before finally stepping back in uneven sequence, as if adjusting to his movement. Jonah felt the hallway shrink around him. He leaned closer, hoping to find a logical explanation in the warped glass, but the reflection seemed to lean in faster, eager, its features sharpening the closer it came. The eyes that stared back were his, but they held an intensity he had never seen in himself, a hunger that seemed to pulse beneath the surface. As he watched, the reflection's chest rose and fell in a rhythm that didn't match his own breathing. When Jonah exhaled, the mirror Jonah inhaled. When he held still, the twin in the glass twitched gently, as though struggling to stay synchronized. A loud crack echoed in the house, snapping him out of his trance. The light flickered. Jonah felt a rush of cold air sweep down the hallway, and the mirror briefly fogged over. When the glass cleared, his reflection was perfectly aligned again, calm and still, as though it had never slipped. But Jonah knew better. Something on the other side had revealed itself, something that was not merely copying him, but observing, learning, waiting for the moment it no longer needed the mirror to mirror him. Jonah had almost convinced himself that the mirror incident was a hallucination brought on by stress, that the whispers in the walls were tricks of an old house settling. But everything changed when the village midwife appeared at the estate's doorstep. She was much older than he remembered, her back bent, her hands knotted with age, but her eyes were sharp, frantic, scanning Jonah's face as though searching for signs only she could recognize. She didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed past him, clutching a weather-beaten satchel to her chest, and marched into the dimly lit parlor with a determination that made Jonah's stomach twist. When she finally spoke, her voice shook with something Jonah couldn't immediately identify. Fear or guilt, maybe both. She told him she had delivered every Langley child for nearly 5 decades, and every birth had followed a grim pattern. The mothers never knew they were carrying twins. The fathers always stood by with an unspoken readiness. And when the first cry filled the room, the second was always silenced before it had a chance to become a life. Jonah felt nauseous listening to her. But the midwife pressed on, her words tumbling out as if she had been waiting decades to unburden herself. She explained that on the night of Jonah's birth, something had gone wrong, or right, depending on how one saw it. When Jonah emerged first, crying and strong, his twin followed seconds later, small but alive, grasping desperately at the air as though demanding a place in the world. The midwife paused then, her breath hitching. She described how Jonah's father had reached instinctively for the second infant, his hands steady with the weight of generations of tradition. This was the moment they had all expected, the moment the Langley line insisted upon. But she couldn't bring herself to let it happen. She confessed that the moment she looked into the newborn's eyes, something ancient and pleading stared back, something she felt had been wronged long before it ever entered this world. She snatched the child away, hiding him from Jonah's father, insisting he hadn't survived the birth. Jonah's pulse thundered as she recounted it, and a terrible clarity dawned on him. His twin had not died. He had been hidden, kept alive somewhere within the estate or its grounds, protected not out of mercy, but out of fear of what killing him would mean. The midwife's voice cracked as she admitted she didn't know if she had saved the child or doomed everyone involved. She claimed she had felt a presence ever since that night, something that followed her through dreams and shadows, whispering Jonah's name with longing and resentment. Now, she said, that presence felt stronger, restless, hungry, as though it had sensed Jonah had returned to the house and knew the time for hiding was over. Jonah felt the world tilt beneath him as the midwife's confession unraveled in his mind, but the dread truly settled in when he began searching the house for proof. The Langley estate was a labyrinth of forgotten rooms and abandoned hallways, many of them sealed since before he was born. Dust lay thick on the floorboards, and every step stirred the smell of old wood and something older still. He had lived here as a child, but realized now how little of the house he had ever actually seen. Guided by instinct more than logic, Jonah descended into the basement, a place he had always avoided without understanding why. The air grew colder the deeper he went, as though the house exhaled frost from wounds buried long ago. At the bottom of the stairs, he found a corridor he didn't remember, its walls damp, its ceiling low enough that he had to bow slightly to move through it. At the far end stood a heavy wooden door secured by a rusted chain and an iron latch. Time and moisture had warped the wood, giving the door an almost swollen appearance, as if it were straining to keep something trapped behind it. Jonah hesitated before touching the latch, but a faint sound from the other side, something like the dragging of fabric or the shift of small feet, pushed him to open it. The door creaked angrily, and the smell of stale air rushed out, thick with neglect and something faintly metallic. Inside was a hidden room, small and windowless, with stone walls that glistened in the dim light of Jonah's flashlight. The first thing he noticed was the bed. Not a crib, not a child's mattress, but a narrow, iron-framed cot, its sheets still indented with the outline of a body long since gone. Next to it, drawings were tacked to the walls, childlike sketches done with charcoal or broken crayons. They showed two boys standing together at first, holding hands, smiling. But as the drawings progressed, the figures drifted apart. One boy grew darker, his outline shaky and fragmented, his eyes large and hollow. The other remained bright, whole, almost glowing. Jonah felt a chill crawl up his spine when he saw the final drawing. One boy sleeping in a bed while the other, pale and wide-eyed, crouched beside him in the dark. Near the cot lay restraints, leather straps worn thin, metal buckles rusted. They weren't medical restraints. They looked handmade, desperate, improvised. Someone had tried to contain the child who lived here, not out of cruelty but out of necessity, as though they feared what he might become if left unchecked. Jonah stepped deeper into the room, noticing scratches on the walls, some high, some low, some clustered near the door where fingernails had dug into the stone. Despite decades of neglect, the room didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused, like a breath held in anticipation. And standing there, Jonah understood a terrible truth. His twin hadn't been hidden far away or given to another family. He had been kept here, beneath the same floors Jonah had walked his whole life. Alone, growing, changing. Waiting for the moment someone returned to open the door, Jonah stood frozen in the hidden room, the silence pressing against him so heavily it felt almost physical. The drawings on the walls seemed to watch him, their hollow-eyed figures tilting in the dim glow of his flashlight. He tried to imagine a child growing up alone in this cold, airless box beneath the estate, hearing footsteps above, hearing laughter, hearing life, and never being part of it. The thought made something twist painfully in his chest, but that was quickly drowned out by a deeper, more primal fear. If his twin had lived here, if he had been confined to this stone tomb for years, then where was he now? The restraints lay open. The bed was empty, and the faint outline that once marked a body on the mattress was fresh enough to suggest someone had been here recently, maybe even within the last few days. Jonah swallowed hard as he backed out of the room, feeling an unnatural coldness creeping into the corridor. The air around him shifted with a silent draft, and the chain on the door rattled faintly, as though touched by an unseen hand. He hurried upstairs, but the house no longer felt like a structure of wood and brick. It felt alive, alert, listening. By the time Jonah reached the ground floor, the storm outside had grown violent, wind shrieking against the windows and thunder rolling through the walls. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the hallway, and in that instant he noticed deep scratches on the inside of the basement door, scratches that hadn't been there before he went down. Long, jagged marks ran across the wood, some crossing over each other chaotically, some forming strange looping shapes like someone trying to write without knowing how. Jonah's breath trembled. He reached out to touch one of the marks, and a fragment of wood broke off under his fingertip, fresh and raw. Then came the sound. A slow, deliberate creak echoed through the house from the east wing, an area sealed since his father died. Jonah spun toward it, heart pounding. The house was supposed to be empty. No one else should have had access to that wing, not unless they had forced it open. The lights flickered as the wind howled again, and Jonah noticed the smell. Earthy, damp, faintly metallic, like the scent from the hidden room, but stronger now, spreading. He followed the sound cautiously, his steps echoing in the dark hallway, until he reached the door to the east wing. It hung slightly open, its lock broken and hanging crookedly from the latch. Splintered wood surrounded the frame. Something had pushed its way out. Not someone. Something. Jonah's pulse hammered in his ears as he edged the door wider. The corridor beyond lay in darkness, but he could hear breathing, a ragged, uneven sound that wasn't his own. It came from deep within the shadows, from something moving low to the ground, shifting with quick, animalistic jerks. And then, as the thunder boomed overhead, Jonah saw a pale hand slide across the floor, fingers splayed, nails too long, dragging slowly toward the light as if testing it. Jonah staggered backward as the pale hand withdrew into the darkness, retreating with a twitchy, unnatural motion that made his stomach knot. The air in the east wing felt colder than the rest of the house, as if the walls had been storing winter inside them for years. Every instinct screamed for him to run, to shut the door and pretend nothing had changed, but something deeper, some mix of dread, curiosity, and a strange pull he couldn't name, kept him rooted to the spot. He called out softly, his voice trembling, barely louder than the storm outside. There was no answer, only a faint scuttling sound, like something dragging itself along the floorboards. When Jonah stepped into the wing, the temperature dropped so sharply that his breath appeared in pale clouds before him. The flashlight beam trembled in his hand, shaking over old furniture draped in sheets, cracked picture frames on the walls, and long untraveled rug runners coated in dust. He caught glimpses of movement at the edge of the light, a quick darting shadow, a flicker of a limb, the brief reflection of an eye watching him from behind a toppled cabinet. But every time he turned the flashlight directly toward it, the space showed nothing but empty corridors. The deeper he ventured, the stronger the strange scent became, that mix of earth and cold iron that clung to the hidden room in the basement. It coated his mouth, thick and metallic, making it hard to swallow. It made him think of damp soil, of old wounds, of something sealed away for too long. Finally, Jonah reached the end of the corridor, where the wing split into two small bedrooms. One door was ajar, swaying slightly with the pulse of the storm. Inside, the moonlight cast a silver beam across the dusty floorboards. Jonah stepped inside, scanning the walls. The room looked untouched for decades, at least at first glance. Then he saw it. In the corner, beneath a broken window, someone had carved shapes into the wood. Hundreds of crude marks formed spirals, slashes, looping figures that tangled together like frantic attempts at communication. Jonah knelt down, shining the flashlight on them, and his blood turned cold. The carvings repeated his name over and over, in shapes that were clumsy but unmistakable. Some were scratched deep, almost desperate. Others were faint, curious, childlike. Jonah stood abruptly, his pulse thundering. Behind him came a faint sound, soft breathing, close enough that he felt warmth brush against his neck. He whirled around, but the room was empty. He tried to calm himself, forcing steady breaths, but then the moonlight shifted and illuminated something on the floor he hadn't noticed before. Small, muddy footprints. They led from the shattered window to the center of the room, circling once, then stopping as if whoever made them had stood there, watching, waiting. Jonah followed the trail slowly, his nerves frayed. As he brought the flashlight down to the final footprint, he froze. A faint print overlapped it. His own, not from tonight, but from childhood, from years ago, as if he and the unseen presence had shared this room long before he ever knew it existed. Jonah stared at the overlapping footprints, the small print, and his own blending together in a way that made the years between them collapse. It felt impossible, yet something inside him recognized it instantly. A memory stirred, faint, fragile, buried deep beneath whole layers of life he had never questioned. He closed his eyes, trying to grasp it. He remembered being a child wandering through the estate, no older than 4 or 5, wandering farther than he was supposed to. He remembered a door left ajar, a cold draft, a soft humming somewhere in the dark. He remembered following it, tiny feet padding across dusty floorboards. And then he remembered laughter. Not his own. Thin, wheezing, almost playful. A child's shape crouched behind a bed frame, peeking out with wide eyes and a shy tilt of the head. Jonah opened his eyes sharply, breath quickening. The memory had always existed as a strange dream he assumed came from childish imagination, but now the reality pressed against him like a hand at his spine. He hadn't imagined another child in the house. He had seen him, played with him, touched his hand. That explained the half-formed recollections that had always haunted him. The sensation of small fingers wrapped around his wrist, the sound of quiet footsteps following him through hallways, the blurry image of a giggling face in his earliest birthday photos that his mother had always brushed off as a trick of light. But the memory darkened too. Jonah recalled his mother rushing in, her face pale, snatching him away with a grip so tight it left marks. She had slammed the door shut with trembling hands, whispering frantic words he couldn't understand. After that day, the East Wing had been locked. Jonah was never allowed to wander alone again. And as he grew older, the memory faded, warped, then disappeared. Until now. A cold realization crawled beneath his skin. His twin hadn't only existed in shadows. He had been beside Jonah, reaching for him, eager for connection in the only way he knew. He had played with Jonah like a brother would, gently at first. But something had been wrong with him, something the adults feared so deeply that they sealed him away again. Jonah leaned against the wall, breath trembling as more fragments surfaced. He remembered waking sometimes to tapping on his bedroom window, soft and rhythmic, like a child asking to be let inside. He remembered hearing faint crying in the night and assuming it was the wind because the adults told him so. He remembered, once, feeling someone crawl into bed beside him while he slept, a small body curling against his back, cold as winter stone. And now, with the weight of truth pressing on him, Jonah understood that his twin had never forgotten him. He had been waiting all this time, trapped in walls and shadows, replaying the only memory that had ever brought him warmth. The brief moment Jonah had seen him, acknowledged him, touched his hand. He had been reaching for that moment again ever since, growing lonelier, hungrier, more desperate with each passing year. And now that Jonah had returned to the house, the twin wasn't hiding anymore. He was trying to finish what had begun at birth, what tradition demanded, what instinct twisted by isolation had transformed into something darker and more inevitable. The bond between them had never died. It had only grown in the dark. Jonah could feel it before he saw it. The presence shifting in the darkness at the end of the East Wing, something low to the ground, moving with an uncanny stillness, as if calculating every motion before taking it. His pulse pounded in his ears, each beat echoing like a drum in the empty hallway, drowning out even the storm outside. Then the moonlight cut across the floor, revealing a figure crouched in the corner. At first glance, it looked like a child, pale, thin, and trembling. But as the figure stood, the resemblance hit Jonah like a physical blow. The face was his own. Every line, every shadowed curve of cheek and chin, the same eyes that had haunted mirrors and shadows for weeks. They were his, yet different, older and hollowed by years spent in darkness. The twin stepped forward, slow, deliberate, and Jonah could see the scars across his wrists and ankles, faint yet unmistakable, reminders of chains that had held him too long. He watched in frozen horror and fascination as the twins' lips curled into a smile, not cruel, not joyous, but a mixture of longing, calculation, and something far older than either of them could name. I waited. The voice said, low and rasping, but unmistakably his own. I've been waiting a lifetime for you to return. Jonah's throat tightened, words failing him, and his mind raced to understand. All the signs, all the whispers, the scratches in the walls, the mirrors, the hidden room, they had led him here. And yet standing in the moonlit hallway, he understood there was more at stake than fear. The twin didn't seek to kill him, not in the way tradition dictated. He sought recognition, a merging, a reclamation of what had been torn away the moment he was hidden. The twins' eyes glimmered with something almost human, desperation, hope, longing, but beneath that shimmer was a raw, primal essence, honed by years alone in darkness. You lived, the twin said, stepping closer, because I chose it. Because I wanted to see if it could be different. If we could be different. Jonah felt a strange warmth in his chest, mingled with ice. He realized then that the centuries of Langley tradition, every twin sacrificed at birth, had not been about survival alone. It had been about balance, about power, about containing a darkness that lived within the line itself. And now that darkness was looking him in the eye, held in the fragile form of the twin who had been denied death. The twin stretched out a hand, mirroring Jonah's hesitation, offering a connection neither of them could deny. Jonah felt the weight of generations pressing against him, the long line of ancestors who had followed the same ritual, and he understood the choice he now held. To turn away, to follow history, to deny the twin, or to reach out, defy the curse, and see what might emerge if two halves of a fractured legacy were finally reunited. The twin waited, pale and silent, the air between them thick with centuries of expectation, the storm outside roaring as if in answer to the moment that had finally come.